Bueno, muchas gracias muchachos por estar aquí en la plática del día de hoy con Anne Herzberg. Anne trabaja en NGO Monitor, una organización muy interesante, muy importante que empecemos a conocer. Anne is part of NGO Monitor, a very important organization that is a very important step for us to know more about the NGO Monitor work. Anne es especialista en Derecho Internacional, es asesora de NGO Monitor para Naciones Unidas, ha dado varias conferencias que las pueden seguir en redes. Es muy importante también que conozcamos voces como la de Anne, no solo NGO de la que ella es parte, sino también el trabajo que ella hace, porque el reporte de Amnistía Internacional, muchachos, tiene un clarísimo sesgo político. ¿Okay? The Amnesty International Report has a very strong political element. Entonces es importante conocer estos sesgos políticos de reportes de agencias de derechos humanos. Podría ser Amnistía, Human Rights Watch, muchísimos otros reportes. Por eso tenemos a Anne como invitada. Anne, thank you very much to be here with us, to share with us all your knowledge about this issue, very important issue. So, as I said to you before, try to speak slowly for us, because we can understand English, but not all can understand very fast. So, thank you, and
Great.
The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Should we take the screen off?
Let me.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay, great. Thank you, Manuel, so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. Again, I apologize. I really don't know Spanish, but it's so important that we have people who can communicate to Latin American audiences in Spanish. So I apologize for that. If I'm speaking too quickly, let me know, and I'll try to slow down. It's also a real pleasure to speak to an audience that I don't normally get to speak with. I understand that Latin America is often neglected when discussing the influence and impact of anti-Israel campaigns. And so again, it's really an honor to speak with you today, and also to learn from your experience. So I really look forward to the questions and answers afterwards. So we're going to speak today about the report issued in early February by Amnesty International accusing Israel of apartheid. And there are so many problems in this report, it would take me many hours to go through them all, which we don't have time for. So I'm just going to make a short presentation, and then, again, happy to discuss in questions and answers. And just to give you a little short introduction to NGO Monitor, we are a Jerusalem-based organization, a research institute, and we look at non-governmental organizations that are active in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we also have UN status. So I am also, in addition to our legal advisor, I am also our UN representative. And so I present a lot at various UN meetings. I gave 2 speeches last week, actually, at the Human Rights Council. And so that's another focus of our work, looking at how NGO reports impact what goes on at the UN, because that also then has a big impact on things like BDS and other issues that you're probably seeing in your countries today. I'm going to talk about the anti-Semitism and the methodological problems in the report, as well as legal and factual problems. But first, before I get into the details of the report, I want to raise, why is Amnesty International even publishing this report right now? What's driving the organization to publish this report? There's nothing new about the report. They say in their report, it took them 4.5 years to write it, which is kind of surprising. Essentially, it's the same report that was issued last year by Human Rights Watch, which in turn was based on a report that was published in 2009. So these are 3 very long reports, all very similar. But with the release of this report, there's been a narrative that NGOs, UN officials, and the media really have been pushing that these reports, Amnesty's report, Human Rights Watch's report, are evidence of a so-called growing critical mass of human rights organizations that are recognizing apartheid in Israel, which is false. But this is the narrative that's being promoted. Now, if you look at the history of the conflict, the apartheid slander, and that's really what I think it is, has been being promoted for more than 70 years, actually. So it's nothing new. And in the past 20 years, it has been promoted by the same small group of people and organizations that have revived the claim in the past year. So 20 years ago, we had the UN Durban Conference in South Africa, and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch were active at that conference. And that conference is sort of where the apartheid slander was renewed. It was the beginning of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. So again, this is nothing new. So again, we ask ourselves, why is this report coming out now? Well, I think there are two reasons.
Anne,
Remember,
sorry.
Yeah.
Some people in the audience asked me to make a brief resume of what you say right now in Spanish.
Sure. No problem, no problem.
Anne nos está presentando el caso diciendo que términos como apartheid han sido utilizados desde hace ya bastante tiempo. Menciona la conferencia de Durban y la pregunta que hace Anne es ¿por qué aparece ahora el reporte? Y lo que nos está explicando Anne es que este es parte de un proceso de larga duración que ha tenido escenarios internacionales donde se ha ido estableciendo el concepto de apartheid sin mucho debate legal, que es lo que ella va a exponer ahora, pero en resumidas cuentas, muchachos, lo que Anne nos dice es que esto no nos debe de sorprender en el sentido de que es un proceso de muchos años, busquen conferencias de Durban, y cómo a lo largo del tiempo se ha ido estableciendo este tipo, no solo de reportes, sino de utilización de los conceptos. Go ahead, Anne, sorry.
No problem. No, that's great. That's a great way to do it. So I think there are two developments as to why Amnesty put out its report now, as well as why Human Rights Watch put its report out last year. So number one is a year ago, the International Criminal Court decided that the prosecutor of the court had jurisdiction to open an investigation against Israel. Now, this was a very controversial decision. It was a 2-1 decision. And it was highly controversial because, as we know, the Palestinian Authority is not a state under international law. And supposedly only states are able to join the International Criminal Court. So that was quite unusual. And another controversial factor is that Israel is not a member of the court. And the court is only supposed to rule on situations where there are in countries that are members of the court. So it was highly controversial, highly unusual that the court decided to get involved. But this has been the dream of groups like Amnesty to perhaps have a case against Israel at the International Criminal Court. So Amnesty, in putting out its report, really wants to capitalize on the ICC investigation because under the statute of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, there is a crime against humanity of apartheid. So this is one of the goals of why the report came out now. Another reason is at the United Nations in 2022, there will likely be 3 reports issued calling Israel apartheid. The first one will be coming out in probably 2 weeks by the UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinians. The second, there is a commission of inquiry that was established last year in May by the Human Rights Council, ostensibly for events that took place during the fighting in May. But it's going to be what they call investigating the root causes of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that report will also likely charge Israel with apartheid. And then also there's a third committee called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in 2018, the Palestinians, again in a highly controversial move and against practice, filed a complaint against Israel at this committee. And the committee, despite the objection of the UN legal office, has decided to go ahead, and they most likely will also try and call Israel apartheid. So again, this is the reason Amnesty released its report now. Now,
Let me explain a little bit.
Yeah.
Anne nos explica que hay dos procesos que explican un poco por qué sale este reporte. Ahora, lo que Anne dice es que por un lado hay un proceso que intenta abrir un caso contra Israel en la Corte ICC, International Criminal Court, la Corte Penal Internacional, de la cual Israel no es miembro. Entonces es un proceso que nos explica por qué hay todo un movimiento para crear este tipo de reportes. Y hay otro proceso que nos explican, que también explica esta situación del reporte, que es que en el 2022 va a aparecer una serie de reportes, una serie de investigaciones, resultados de investigaciones, que tienden a coincidir en que Israel es un estado de apartheid. Hay comisiones de investigación de diferentes organismos e incluso se quiere enmarcar el tema de Israel dentro de la eliminación de discriminación racial. Entonces lo que nos ha explicado es que hay un proceso de muchas agencias en las cuales se inserta el Amnistía Internacional, Human Rights Watch, que intentan colocar el tema en la Corte Penal Internacional, que ahí les invito a que investiguen sobre por qué no es tan factible que o legalmente que se establezca en la Corte Penal Internacional, y por otro lado, esta lucha por enmarcar el tema de Israel dentro del concepto de apartheid, que es un crimen que se persigue. Sorry, Anne, go ahead.
No worries. So before I get into, again, to the details of the report, let's just talk a little bit about apartheid, just so we refresh our memories. So apartheid is a legal term stemming from the policies and practices in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, that ended in the early 1990s. And this charge has been used against Israel to delegitimize Zionism and to attack Israel's legitimacy. And apartheid, as we remember, was a system of complete racial segregation, where whites were at the top and blacks were at the bottom. And in the middle, you had what they call coloreds, people who didn't fit either category. And the entire society was separated and segregated out into racial lines. And there are many other factors of apartheid. It was a horrific system. You can read about we have a report that I'll mention in a few minutes where we go into the details, but there's many books and articles written where they describe what apartheid is. Now, the apartheid charge began against Israel in the late 1950s and 1960s. And the UN has been the primary venue for this apartheid attack. So it was originally used by the Arab states in UN debates, as well as by members of the states that were part of the Soviet bloc. And it relied a lot on Soviet propaganda in the types of claims it was making. In more recent years, the past 15 years or so, as not only at the Durban conference, but we've seen a few UN officials and now these human rights NGOs making this claim. Now, interestingly, I was at an event, 3 UN events last week on Israel. Even though the Ukraine situation is going on, the UN is still having many debates against Israel. And at each of these debates, all of the NGOs were claiming apartheid. So this is clearly a coordinated campaign. Now what is powerful about the apartheid charge is it's an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitism to transform the Arab-Israeli conflict from one of disputed land and Arab rejection of a Jewish presence in the Middle East to one of Jewish racism. And as we are all very familiar, being accused of being racist is probably one of the worst things someone can say to you. And South African apartheid really was one of the worst human rights crimes of the 20th century. Another powerful aspect of the apartheid charge is that it includes a plan of action. It means boycotts, international isolation, and ultimately elimination. And that's why they're using this plan against Israel. The claim of apartheid also, as it's used against Israel, also includes a combination of what is known as both old and new anti-Semitism. So old anti-Semitic tropes that are seen particularly in the Amnesty reports are things like Jews being sneaky and nefarious, exerting secret power, wanting to dominate and control non-Jews, or that Jews exert control over world bodies and governments. Also, the charge includes new anti-Semitism, and we can find an example of this in the International Holocaust Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, IHRA, Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. So in that definition, which has been adopted by more than 30 countries, including the Organization of American States, says that denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor is a form of anti-Semitism. And of course, the apartheid accusation against Israel is a more extreme version of Zionism as racism. And the European Union issued a handbook on the definition, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and they explain what this means about calling Israel racist. It says, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination in a national homeland is anti-Semitic because it denies the religious and historic ties of Jews to the land of Israel. It evades the fact that the state of Israel was founded in 1948 based on Resolution 181 of the United Nations General Assembly. Moreover, asserting that a country is racist by portraying ambivalent aspects of modern statehood in a demonizing manner exclusive to Israel is an attempt to undermine the international legitimacy of the country. And this is all found in the Amnesty report. Other ways in which the report is anti-Semitic, we should look back to what is known as the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism, made popular by Natan Sharansky. So he says that when you have double standards, demonization, and delegitimization, that is anti-Semitism. And again, we see that in this report. For instance, Amnesty does not call out actual racial supremacy practices in many Muslim countries or religious supremacy practices, such as blasphemy laws, conversion laws that are punished by death, the banning of Bibles, the banning of church services. They say nothing about the position of Palestinians in Lebanon, who are barred from many professions, who cannot own property in Lebanon. It doesn't call for the elimination of the 56 Muslim majority countries. It doesn't call these countries a regime of domination and oppression, even though the practices in those countries are far worse than anything that you could say about Israel. It also ignores that in the Palestinian Authority, they call themselves a Muslim and Arab state, and they also make it punishable by death to sell property to Jews. So, and they want to have their Palestinian state, should there be one, to be free of Jews. So again, none of these things are called apartheid by Amnesty. Amnesty doesn't even bother looking at these other situations. Also, I would point out, there was a very interesting article in the Times of Israel in early February, where the reporter interviewed members of Amnesty International about the report. And they basically said, it was quite astounding because they basically said in that article, yeah, we haven't looked at China, and they couldn't give a good example of why they've never looked at the Uyghur situation in China and as whether that's apartheid. And they also made a claim that they had to go after Israel because the United Nations doesn't, because Israel controls what goes on at the United Nations, which, if anyone knows anything about the United Nations, is completely ridiculous. And again, it just shows the type of anti-Semitism motivating the people who put the report together. And Amnesty, unfortunately, even though it's interesting, Amnesty was founded in the 1960s by a Jew who was born in Jerusalem and was a Zionist. But today, they have gone very far from that path. And unfortunately, the organization has had a real problem with anti-Semitism in recent years. They don't cover it as a topic. Very rarely do they do any reporting on it. Some of their staff members have made anti-Semitic jokes in recent years. They actually had an investigation on anti-Semitism, which the leadership of Amnesty basically whitewashed. And in 2015, this was quite interesting. Amnesty UK was adopting its agenda of work for the coming year, and they had 16 resolutions. They adopted 15 resolutions and rejected one. And the one resolution they rejected was to look at anti-Semitism in the UK, which at the time was at very high levels. So they agreed to do everything except look at anti-Semitism. So there's a real problem with the organization. Now, the report has many factual problems, and I'll just list a few. Again, it would take me hours to go through them all. And there are people now who are, it's a 280-page report, more than 1,000 footnotes. So there are people right now going through all of the footnotes, and they've found so many factual problems, so many sources that have been misrepresented. But so I'm just going to hit on some of the main problems that I noticed from reading this report. The first thing that really jumped out at me was the completely invented history of the conflict. So if you were reading Amnesty's report, you would never know that there was a Balfour Declaration, there was a League of Nations mandate, that up until Israel's declaration of independence, that there was a partition plan, that the international community agreed to the creation of a Jewish state. You would not know this from Amnesty's report. And instead, and you would not know that the Arab armies invaded Israel upon its declaration of independence. You would not know that there have been decades and decades long campaigns of terrorism against Israel, that there have been, that the 1967 war was aimed at eliminating Israel. You would know none of this from Amnesty's report. And their main claim is that Israel is responsible. They're saying Israel is apartheid because it is responsible for dividing the Palestinian people into 4 categories: Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinian refugees and their millions of descendants abroad, and I know in Chile there's quite a large population apparently, and in Israel itself. So they're saying Israel deliberately divided the Palestinian people into these 4 groups, and in order to dominate the Palestinians because of a practice of Jewish supremacy that is inherent to Zionism. So this is Amnesty's claim in the report. This is also why it is anti-Semitic, and this terminology of domination, river to the sea, as we know, is an anti-Semitic phrase. So it's a real complete fabrication of history. So it ignores that when Israel was founded in 1948, the only people responsible for dividing the Palestinian people were the Arab armies that invaded Israel. So were it not for that invasion, there would have been no refugees from the area, and there wouldn't have been a political division of Palestinians into Gaza, which in 1948 was not controlled by Israel, but was controlled by Egypt, and the West Bank and parts of Jerusalem controlled by Jordan. None of this would have been the case. There would have been, according to the UN partition plan, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Also, interestingly, in the partition plan and previous plans that called for the division into 2 states, Israel was always expected to have a very large Arab population. So it was going to be something like 60% Jews, 40% Arabs. That was always the plan, whereas the Arab state in this partition plan was going to have no Jews. So again, it's a complete reversal of history. The actual plan was to have no Jews in an Arab state, but the Jewish state is expected to have a large Arab majority, which it does. Also, when it comes to the refugees, at the time, an international committee was formed to solve the refugee crisis from the 48 war. And in the plans for that resolution, Israel actually agreed to take back 200,000 Palestinians who had fled to neighboring countries. The Arab states agreed to take back zero refugees, to resettle zero refugees. So while Israel was willing to take back 200,000 people, plus Israel resettled nearly 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab countries, the surrounding Arab countries refused to resettle and make part of their population Palestinian refugees. So again, the refugee problem is not because of Israel, but rather because of the Arab states' refusal to resolve the conflict. So instead, we get UNRWA, that rather than solving the refugee crisis, has maintained it. So again, you would know none of this from Amnesty's report. And then again, it completely glosses over the Oslo Accords, for instance. So after, in 1993 to 1995, the PLO and Israel mutually agreed to basically the establishment of a Palestinian government with the idea that it would eventually lead to Palestinian statehood. It did not, because the Palestinians refused at Camp David to accept a statehood agreement and instead launched a massive campaign of suicide bombings. But the Oslo Accords basically set up how the territory of the West Bank and Gaza were to be governed. And instead of noting that this Oslo agreement was agreed to by the PLO and Israel and witnessed and guaranteed by the international community, again, Amnesty portrays it as some sort of nefarious evil plot for Israel to maintain Jewish supremacy. So again, these are just some of the main factual problems in the report. Other things in the report are things like the law of return. So again, in the wake of the Holocaust, the law of return, and because of the, as we all know, the centuries old, thousands, millennial, really, not just centuries, millennial problem of anti-Semitism, Israel was designed as a safe haven for Jews. So again, Amnesty is saying that is illegal under international law, which is false. There are many similar practices in other countries where people who have an identification with their homeland, diaspora communities, can have a separate track to obtain citizenship, such as in Greece, Turkey, Germany, Ireland. There are many countries like this, but only in Israel is this illegal, according to Amnesty. Even in countries like Spain and Portugal and Germany and Austria, Jews recently are now being given the opportunity to obtain citizenship in these countries to remedy the Holocaust, to remedy the Inquisition. And again, Amnesty has no problem with this. So the only problem that Amnesty has a problem with are Jews who can obtain citizenship coming to Israel, the Jewish state. So again, another example of their report, their nefarious reports. Another thing in the report that is outrageous is its approach to terrorism. So it completely erases or whitewashes Palestinian terrorism. The suicide bombing campaign, which I just mentioned from the 2000s, is referred to simply as bombs were placed in crowded areas. So they completely erase the nature of this horrible campaign, thousands of Israelis murdered, injured, and because of how severe this campaign was, the severe policies that Israel had to put in place in order to protect itself from suicide bombings. And again, rather than looking at the full context, Amnesty simply calls those policies, many of which have been removed now that it's the terrorism situation, although it's still quite acute, is not as bad as it was 20 years ago, thank God. Let's hope it doesn't start up again. But Amnesty ignores all of this and basically calls those apartheid policies. So again, anything Israel does, it's apartheid. The context is completely erased. Now, I just want to go into the legal claims a little bit. I won't get too complicated because it is hard to, unless you're really into the details of international law, it might be a bit confusing. So I'll just sort of touch on it from a broad perspective. And if you want more detail, I, in December of last year, 2021, published a report with a UK barrister named Josh Kern. And we looked at the international legal definition of apartheid and how this applies to Israel. And Manuel wrote a very good summary of that report, so I thank him for that. And we are also in a couple of weeks going to be publishing a second report where we are going to look at specific policies in the conflict, things like the law of return, the nation state law, terrorism, and how it applies to the definition. So you can read the report online from December 2021, as well as our report that will be coming out in a couple of weeks for more detail. But interestingly, so what's interesting, and it's surprising because obviously for decades we've heard about apartheid. You know, it was one of the biggest agenda items for the international community, you know, in the 70s and 1980s, up until the end of apartheid in about 1994. And everyone knows apartheid is bad, but surprisingly, there is no one definition of apartheid. So it's actually quite interesting. So there are a few treaties that say apartheid is illegal. One treaty is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, but that treaty doesn't provide a definition of apartheid. It just says apartheid is illegal. It doesn't provide any information, what is apartheid? There are two treaties. One is known as the Apartheid Convention of 1973, which notes that apartheid is a crime against humanity, where individuals can be and calls for individuals to be prosecuted and convicted for a crime against humanity. So you have a definition of apartheid in that treaty, but that treaty was drafted during the Cold War. And it was clear in the drafting that the Soviets wanted to use this treaty as a weapon against Western countries. So no Western countries signed this treaty. So in international law, unless you sign a treaty, you are not bound by that treaty. Although with what the International Criminal Court did, I don't know, all bets are off nowadays. But so no Western countries were part of this treaty, which means it is not binding on those countries. Israel did not sign this treaty. And the way in which the crime of apartheid is defined does not yet appear in what is known as customary law. So if there is no treaty, a country could still be required to observe rules if those rules have found their way into what is known as customary.
Vamos a pasar a buscar con la Dani para ir a almorzar, ¿te parece?
Sorry.
Should I keep going?
No, you go.
Okay. So there is no definition yet in customary law for apartheid. In 1998, the International Criminal Court Treaty, the Rome Statute, was drafted and accepted. And in the Rome Statute, there is a crime against humanity, as I mentioned, against apartheid. Now, that treaty has more states that have signed up to it. So that is probably the most binding definition at the moment, although Israel is not a member of the Rome Statute, so it's not bound by this treaty, even though the ICC claims it is, and it's going to act as if it is, but it's not in law. But unfortunately, a lot of international institutions overstep their bounds. But when you look at the definition in the Rome Statute, is actually quite vague. So it uses terms such as domination and oppression. And these terms are, what do these terms mean? They're not defined in the treaty. So what does it mean to be a regime of domination and systematic oppression? Unclear. So that's one problem. Another problem is the 1973 convention notes, it says you have to look at what the practices were in South Africa to help tell us what apartheid is. Again, because there's no clear definition, and the only case we know of internationally is that of South Africa. So when you are looking at how to define apartheid, you have to look at what the practices and policies were in apartheid South Africa. Now, Amnesty does not do that. Amnesty says they don't need to look at apartheid South Africa. Now, that is wrong as a legal matter. Also, rather than looking at domination and the word oppression and how those terms have been used in legal by courts or other legal instruments, Amnesty and repeating Human Rights Watch and some legal scholars, and like I said, it's really quite interesting. Not many people have written about this, even though you think they would have. They basically just went to the dictionary. So they didn't even do a legal definition analysis. They just looked up the Oxford Dictionary and used the definition of domination from the dictionary, okay? Now, under that definition in the dictionary, they decide, and this is also copying off of Human Rights Watch, that domination means control. Now, and so because Israel controls supposedly Palestinians, it is apartheid regime. Now, this is quite ridiculous because control is a very low standard. It would mean that any place there's a power differential between countries, so you could say United States versus Canada or United States versus Mexico. You know, what we're seeing now, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Germany and Poland. You know, anytime you have a very strong country next to a weaker country, that would be apartheid, according to these NGOs. Or where there are minority groups, where you have a dominant minority culture. So, you know, in certain countries, I'm trying to think of another good example. You know, if you have, let's say in France, you have French, the main French culture, but you also have a Basque culture, which is a minority culture. But let's say France puts more money into promoting the majority French culture as opposed to the minority Basque culture, that could be considered, or in Spain also, that could be considered apartheid, according to these NGOs. Now, the other thing that they're doing is, and this is a little bit complicated, but so Amnesty and HRW view the West Bank as being occupied. So that when there's an occupied territory, that invokes what is known as international humanitarian law, IHL. And there are specific law, it's not illegal to have an occupied territory, but if you have an occupied territory, special rules apply. And that's the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, a few other rules. So when you have an occupied territory, you have these rules. Now, interestingly, in the law of occupation, you are allowed as an occupying power to treat the occupied people differently than you treat your own citizens, your own nationals. So, and Amnesty and HRW view the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza to be occupied. So it's quite interesting. They are claiming this territory is occupied, and therefore under the law of occupation, you can have differences in treatment of peoples. So this poses a problem for them, because if you want to claim it's occupied, then it's okay to treat people differently. So what are they doing? That's why they also claim the definition of apartheid means control, because they want to basically erase the laws of occupation, to say that these differences are not allowed because of apartheid. So it's a little complicated, but that's also what they're doing, even though they're also kind of contradicting themselves in their own legal paradigm of the territories. So these are some of the legal problems. And so I think I'll stop here and I'll take questions. But I do think we need to expect, there is going to be a lot more talk about this because of these UN reports that are coming out. I don't think in the next year, at least, the International Criminal Court will be dealing with this issue. In the prosecutor's report to the UN, to the state parties of the court in December, he basically said he's trying to prioritize resources. And so Israel right now is not at the top of his priority list, but it could be in a year or two. It could be he's waiting to see what these UN reports say. So right now it's an open question whether or not the ICC is going to get involved in apartheid, but it could. And I imagine that if these UN reports, make the case for apartheid, then the ICC probably will look at it more closely. Certainly the NGOs will heavily lobby the court to adopt these UN reports. But even without the ICC, another thing that these reports are aimed to do in the NGO and UN reports is to promote BDS. So if you look at the recommendations in Amnesty's reports, it calls for an arms embargo on Israel. It calls for boycotts and divestments against Israel. And that's really, I think, where the report will be used. It will be used to bolster these campaigns because those involve soft power. You don't need laws or courts to get involved a lot of the time. Or I know, like in Chile right now, there's a law pending, I believe, on settlement goods. So it's for these types of things that the report is going to be used for. And unfortunately, I think what the report also will be used for is, unfortunately, could lead to increasing anti-Semitism on Jews in the diaspora, Jews on Chile, Mexico, Argentina. That I am worried about that there will be an increase in attacks on Jewish communities, citing apartheid. And we've even seen that now in the UK on a lot of signs, protests against Israel, and they claim apartheid. And then there's harassment of Jews, attacks on Jews because of apartheid. And so that's a real fear for me. So these are the types of things we need to look at and speak out against. And so if you see in your country that parliamentarians are using this Amnesty report to promote this BDS law in Chile or to say anti-Semitic things, it's really important to speak out against them and to say that this report is built on a foundation of lies and anti-Semitism and should not be seen as a credible report. So happy to take questions.
Thank you, Anne. Was very interesting to listen to you. We have some questions, so I will read it in order as they arrive. Muchas gracias, Anne, por la charla. Muy importante tener este tipo de pláticas que ojalá, muchachos, tomamos esto en serio y hagamos este tipo de reflexiones cada vez que surge un reporte, no solo sobre Israel, sino posibles reportes sobre Rusia, crímenes, etcétera. Es muy importante tener un contexto. Voy a leer las preguntas como fueron llegando, si les parece. The first question, Anne, is what's the best way to think about and analyze the situation in the territories, I suppose the Palestinian territories? Under international law, are occupied territories, disputed territories, occupied and disputed territories? What's your opinion?
So I think so it's interesting. It is clearly disputed territories. And I think when you look at, especially the peace agreements with Jordan in 1994, the disengagement from Gaza, for sure, Gaza is no longer occupied, in my opinion. Israel completely left, pulled out all Israelis that were based in Gaza. And there was a peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, and then you have the Oslo Accords. So I think disputed territories is the proper paradigm for the territories. However, I'll just add this caveat. Factually, there is a military administration in control of parts of the West Bank, so Area C. You have East Jerusalem is part of Israel, so the same laws apply in East Jerusalem as the rest of Israel. And then areas A and B are under Palestinian control. And actually in Area C, most of the civil functions towards Palestinians are actually under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. But there is a military administration that is in charge of certain aspects of life for Palestinians in Area C. And because of that, the Israeli Supreme Court applies humanitarian provisions of the Geneva Conventions when it's dealing with cases with Palestinians. So it may not be de jure, by law, a classic occupation, but the Israeli courts at least apply certain provisions of that law towards the Palestinian people. And I think that's fair, a fair way to do it, because it is a unique situation, and there is a military administration for parts of the territory. So it's not a clear-cut distinction, but I do think the court has handled it the most just way, so that the people living there are the most protected, and are not without protection.
Perfect, very good answer. I tend to agree with you, but at the end of the day, there is occupation of some territory that is not yours. And it's not a question, only a commentary. We need to talk legally about the Golan Heights.
Right.
It's funny. Not many people is talking about Golan Heights when
right.
there is more occupied territory that West Bank. So it's other conference. So
it's
another
true.
question for you.
Right. It's a more classically occupied territory than the West Bank. And I'll just say, the real way in order to solve these problems is negotiations, which unfortunately the Palestinian Authority is not willing to engage in right now. So that's the way that we should be resolving all of these issues. So I just want to add that. Yeah,
I agree with you. A question from Rodrigo Sangüesa. When did Amnesty International start taking an anti-Israeli path?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So like I said, it was founded by a Zionist in the 1960s, a man born in Jerusalem, a Jewish man. Over the decades, so Amnesty was originally started as an organization for prisoners of conscience. So writing letters for people who are prisoners of conscience. Some of you maybe even remember writing such letters in school. I used to do that in high school. And they also actually used to have very strong standards that if you were involved in violence, you could not be considered a prisoner of conscience. I believe actually at first Nelson Mandela was not considered a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty. I have to look that up. But I believe in that case, and initially they said he was not, because I have to double check. But there were some notable cases of people that you would think are prisoners of conscience, but because maybe they advocated for violence or represented, he didn't certainly not towards the end of his life, but maybe just at the beginning. So I don't want to, cast aspersions on him. But so initially they were not dealing with violent actors or representatives of violent organizations. And over time, we saw an expansion of Amnesty's mandate. So in the 1980s, they actually got much more involved in Latin America. Because of United States involvement in Latin America. So you did see more attention to those types of issues. You saw Amnesty going more into armed conflict. So rather than just focusing on political prisoners, they started focusing on armed conflict. So that started shifting in the 1980s. And then they also started expanding to a more, I guess what you could term a more socialist or leftist political agenda, a more economic. So there's two types of human rights, or in the area of human rights. There's what is known as negative human rights, which are political human rights, rights to fair trial, equality, right to free speech, right to freedom of religion. So those types of rights are known as negative rights, where states are not allowed to infringe on those rights. Then there's this whole other category of rights known as economic and social rights, right to health, right to education, right to the family. And typically, because the Western countries were very strong on these political rights, the negative rights, the Soviet bloc often would push these economic rights because they were stronger on the economic rights and much weaker on the political rights. So in the 1980s, you saw Amnesty take on more of this socialist economic rights. And again, that broadened out their mandate. And also they seem to take a more leftist view of victims, so you have, the West was bad and anti-communist forces were bad. Communists, people who are pro-communist were good. That was sort of the paradigm they were operating from. So, or what is known also as a post-colonial outlook. So, former colonial powers bad, colonial subjugated colonial peoples good. So, and it didn't matter what either group did. So you could have Western powers doing good things, but because they were the evil Western power in this paradigm, it was always bad. And you could have the people who are subject to colonialism doing bad things, but because they were victims, nothing they did could be considered bad. And so we see that in Amnesty and how they approach the Arab-Israeli conflict. So Israel is bad and Palestinians are good. So it doesn't matter what either group is doing, everything has to be placed into that outlook.
Thank you, Anne. I want to add, maybe will be a great homework for all of us to make some kind of timeline and see who put the money in Amnesty International and who works in Amnesty International in different period of time. So I think it's a good way to start to see this change of the position of Amnesty International, because, be brutally honest, who put the money dictate the agenda. So, and who works inside these NGOs or organizations like Amnesty International, who work the names and the curriculum they have is a good key. It's a good key to see the interest of the organization. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's interesting. So it's interesting. Amnesty is very secretive. So you have the structure of Amnesty. There are two entities in the UK, actually four. There's and you have the organization of Amnesty and you have the charitable arm of Amnesty. And they don't publish their donor information. They have a budget of over 300 million pounds, but they don't publish their information. So it's very difficult to even find today who's giving them money. Then you have all the branches in the various countries. So I'm sure there's Amnesty Chile and Amnesty Mexico. I'm sure there are branches in all of the countries. And then I believe the way it works is the national branches pay dues to the international. So one way maybe to find out, and I don't know what the, in Israel, you can do this because there's a registrar for NGOs and they have to disclose their donors. And in America also for the most part. So I don't know in Chile or Mexico, Argentina, if organizations are required to list their donors, but that might be an interesting way to go. to see who in the national branches are giving the money. So that's at least one way to find out some of the money. But again, it's very hard to find out where most of their money is coming from. But I think it is a great idea to study that over time, to try to figure that out. And then certainly who works there also is also important. Yes.
We have two more questions for you. I will translate. What kind of tool can we use to fight this report in the academy, but also in the political sphere? The question is from, let me see the name, Brian. Brian is asking, what can we do to fight? What kind of tools, academic tools, diplomatic tools, can we use in this concept?
So it's hard. It's very hard. Unfortunately, in academia, it's definitely the Palestinian narrative dominates. However, if you know any academics in Latin America, in South America that are more, pro-Israel, I guess, in outlook, or more fair, not totally anti-Israel, encouraging those people to write articles or to speak at conferences is really important. I don't know if it exists in South America and in Latin America, if it exists student groups, pro-Israel student groups. So that can be very important to host events. I know we were speaking earlier, Manuel, about the lack of speakers in your countries, pro-Israel speakers. So, I do think it's an important, I don't know if it's the Israeli government that needs to do it, or maybe organizations from America, Jewish organizations that can train students in South America, in Mexico, in other countries in Central America to learn how to advocate for Israel and to learn to provide the truth for a lot of these campaigns. So that's one thing that probably should be looked at. I don't know, the Jewish Agency maybe, something that they can do. I don't know if they're already doing that. That's really important, because if you educate the students, eventually those students will become people in the government or academics, and that's how you can break the cycle. The other thing is to coordinate with not hostile parliamentarians, to organize, again, events or make speeches in the various parliaments, or ask parliamentary questions, exposing this report. I think that's another good way to block what's happening.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it will be great if someday Chilean parliamentaries can talk to you openly about the report. So good idea. We have another question from Masha.
Be happy to. Yeah, that would be a great thing to organize. Yeah.
You see, let me say something. The sad part of the history is that anyone is talking to the other side. We are only yelling. We are not talking. We are not have any kind of fair debate about, in this case, the report. So it's my opinion. So okay, we have another question from Masha. Masha is asking, as Israel is not part of the International Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, what consequences the report might have to Israel, and what authority the report have to judge the situation? Maybe, and it will be very brief, if you can explain to us the process to be part of the International Criminal Court, at what kind of consequences you will face, even if you are not part of the International Criminal Court.
Right. Okay. So, and I'll just add for the last question, just before I get into that, that people like you listening to the webinar could write op-eds and letters to the editor for your local newspapers if they'll publish it. But that might also be a way to go to get a more pro-Israel side out into the public. Okay, so the International Criminal Court, as I mentioned, Israel is not a member. However, the prosecutor has decided to go ahead anyway against Israel. Now, so what does this mean? so what happens is the prosecutor can file indictments against individuals. And then if they move along through the system, there could be a trial of an official and they could go to jail if they're convicted. Now, the likelihood of that is probably highly unlikely because the court, it's possible that they will indict some Israelis, probably not on apartheid, but maybe on war crimes or something. I could see that happening because they seem determined to move forward. But the likelihood of the court being able to actually arrest Israelis or to try Israelis is quite unlikely because the court does not have the ability to arrest people. So unless, a European country is going to invade Israel and hand over Israelis to the court in The Hague, it's unlikely. Now, could there be a case where an Israeli official doesn't realize they're under indictment and they stupidly travel to Switzerland or some country like that and they get arrested? That might happen. It's a possibility. Unlikely, but it could happen. So it's unlikely that there are going to be any trials of Israelis or convictions. However, it's the PR value. So the fact that there would be indictments of Israelis claiming war crimes or crimes against humanity, it's very damaging for the country as a whole. And what it could mean is other countries, Europe or in South America, might decide to put sanctions or something on Israel based on this indictment, or pass a law or something like, oh, no Israelis can travel to our country, or something like that. That's a possibility. And just the negative PR against Israel, which again just furthers the bad feelings about Israel and Jews across the world. Another thing that the report could harm Israel is, let's say, on boycotts. So you have, companies might decide, or academic institutions or cultural events might decide to boycott Israelis at their events outside of Israel, or decide not to come to Israel because of these events. And it's also possible, a lot of times the boycott campaigns are very public, but there is something known as a silent boycott where a company may not actually do business in Israel because of a report like this, but we wouldn't necessarily know about it because they don't talk about it. So that could also be the effect where there's an increase in activity or sanctions activity against Israel stemming from these reports. And I'll just say in the past, like in the UK, in the early, I think it was around 2010, the UK government decided to not sell certain military parts to Israel because of an Amnesty International report, where they were basically saying these parts were being used in human rights abuses. And so the government at the time passed a law about it for exporting certain parts. I don't know if it was overturned recently, but so that could be another way in which the report could be used. So it's really important, if you see in your own countries any of these efforts starting to happen, to really fight against it at the beginning before it can become like a real problem.
That's a good way to put the consequences of the report, because it's a local consequences. It's the
Right.
consequence in Chile, in Mexico. Maybe some countries doesn't face any kind of consequences, but I have a final question for you. What kind of legal documents we can read to understand the issue in the territories? I don't care right now about the reports. Please give us an advice to read what kind of document. You say the Geneva Convention. Okay, say to us a little, I don't know how to say, guide to read the legal aspect of the facts.
Okay, so I will recommend our report that's coming out in 2 weeks. So that'll have some of it, hopefully in clear language. Another person, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's given a lot of good talks and written a lot of interesting articles. So he's a good source of information. Actually, what's really, if people can read it, a lot of the Israeli Supreme Court decisions are published in English. So those cases are actually quite good to give an overview of the status and how Israel views the status. It gives a good summary. So I would recommend that if people, and it's not, the English isn't too hard, so if your English is decent, I think you could understand the legal opinions. And I think those are a really great way to understand. And then for people who are more legally oriented, there's a law, actually I have a copy here, I'll show you. There's a law professor named Yoram Dinstein, and he's an expert on the law of occupation. So he's written this book, for instance, which is the International Law of Belligerent Occupation. So that's also a very good book to give you an overview of the laws. And he discusses a lot of the factual situations that we deal with in the conflict here.
At the end of the day, occupation is part of the legality. It's not illegal or immoral. Okay, we can deal if it's immoral. It's a very long occupation. But at the end of the day, we have to deal with occupation in legal terms because
yes.
it's legally framed in the legal system. So sadly, the Amnesty report doesn't fit with the legal, not only definition, but also not in the methodological way to do a decent report. So that's why for us it's very important to listen to you today. We want to say thank you because it's Sunday. You take your free time to talk with us. Please, por favor, acérquense al trabajo de NGO Monitor. We will try to put in Spanish some of the NGO Monitor publication to put in a broader way to read it. But thank you, Anne. We appreciate here from Chile, from Mexico, from Argentina, from Venezuela. We have a couple of guys from Venezuela. Samuel is here. So, Anne, thank you. Very welcome here in Chile. And I hope in the future we can think a different projects to help to understand this complex situation.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope one day to be able to travel to your countries. I've always wanted to go. So
yeah, welcome here in Chile. You
in person. Great.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.